Back in the Middle Ages, life was hard and food spoiled fast, but some smart peasants found foods that lasted forever. No fridge, no freezer, just old tricks that worked. These foods never went bad, even after years. Here are the ones they always kept stocked, just in case. And first on that list, the one thing that could save your food, your soup, and maybe even your life: salt. In medieval times, salt wasn't just that white stuff you sprinkle on French fries. It was practically worth its weight in gold, kind of like how teenagers today treat their phone chargers. Peasants treasured salt above almost all other foods because it never expired. Never. Not in years, not in decades, not even in centuries. Archaeological digs have uncovered perfectly usable salt from ancient Roman times, over 1,000 years old, still ready to season your dinner. That's older than most grandparents' jokes and somehow more useful. When winter loomed and food grew scarce, salt became the medieval peasant's secret weapon against starvation. It was basically their version of a refrigerator, except it didn't beep when you left the door open too long. They'd rub it into strips of meat and fish, drawing out moisture that would otherwise let bacteria throw a party. This dry-curing method transformed perishable foods into long-lasting provisions that could feed families for months. Medieval salt was so effective at preserving meat that some jerky from the 1300s probably still tastes better than modern airline food. Storage was simple but strategic. Most households kept their precious salt in small ceramic pots with tight-fitting lids, usually placed near the hearth where heat kept dampness away. If a medieval peasant dropped salt, they didn't just throw it over their shoulder for luck. They'd practically dive across the room to salvage every grain. The economics of salt shaped entire communities. In some regions, a sack of salt could buy you a cow. Today, we trade our cows for smartphones that expire faster than dairy products. Villages developed around salt mines and seawater evaporation ponds, with entire family lineages dedicated to its production. Most peasants could only afford to buy salt once or twice a year at seasonal markets, carefully rationing their supply through lean times. They tracked their salt usage more carefully than modern parents monitor their kids' screen time. During the harshest famines, salt became the difference between life and death. One medieval account describes how a family survived an entire winter on nothing but salted turnips and water. That's like living on nothing but kale smoothies, except medieval peasants didn't have Instagram to brag about their suffering. While that dinner menu sounds about as appealing as chewing on a boot, it kept them alive when their neighbors weren't so fortunate. The most resourceful peasants even used salt to preserve food they couldn't immediately eat, creating a medieval version of food storage banking. Their retirement plan wasn't a 401k, it was a well-stocked root cellar with enough salt to make a cardiologist faint. They'd salt away summer's bounty, knowing that when hunger came knocking in February, they had something even sweeter than salt to fall back on. Honey ranked as the medieval world's favorite sweetener, and unlike modern candy bars, it literally never expired. Scientists testing honey from ancient Egyptian tombs over 4,000 years old found it still perfectly edible. The world's oldest working sweetener that doesn't require a prescription. This golden liquid remained just as delicious after a few centuries as it was the day bees produced it. Why didn't it spoil? The secret lies in honey's chemistry. Its super low moisture content and natural acidity create an environment where bacteria simply give up and die. It's basically a bacteria retirement home where they check in but never check out. This made honey incredibly valuable to medieval peasants who couldn't just pop down to the corner store when they ran out of sugar. Medieval families stored their precious honey supply in sealed clay pots or wooden containers with tight-fitting lids. The containers were often kept in cool, dark corners of homes where temperature remained stable. Many households kept their honey pots near the ceiling, hanging from rafters to prevent curious children or hungry animals from raiding this liquid gold. The medieval version of putting cookies on the top shelf, except this treat could outlast the shelf itself. Beyond sweetening bland medieval porridge, honey served as a natural medicine cabinet. Its antibacterial properties made it effective for treating wounds and burns, a remedy so powerful that modern doctors sometimes still use medical-grade honey for treating stubborn infections. Medieval peasants would apply honey directly to cuts, knowing somehow that it killed germs before anybody even knew germs existed. Beekeeping wasn't just a hobby in medieval times, it was serious business. Entire villages sometimes pooled resources to maintain communal hives, sharing the honey harvest according to how much each family contributed to hive maintenance. Finding wild honey became such a valued skill that honey finders could earn special social status in some communities. As winter stretched on and food stores dwindled, a spoonful of honey could make even the most boring meal tolerable. But when even honey seemed too ordinary, medieval peasants turned to something with a bit more bite. Hard cheese became a medieval survival staple thanks to aging processes that turned milk into something nearly indestructible. Forget those soft, spreadable cheeses in your refrigerator. Medieval hard cheese could survive a year without refrigeration and still be perfectly edible. The secret? Time, salt, and patience. Lots of patience. Creating these long-lasting cheeses started with fresh milk from goats, sheep, or cows, depending on what animals the peasant family kept. After separating curds from whey, the cheesemaker pressed out every last drop of moisture and added generous amounts of salt. The salt quantities would make modern nutritionists clutch their blood pressure monitors in horror. But this heavy salting served an essential purpose. It created an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't survive. The aging process transformed these simple ingredients into something remarkable. For months, these cheese rounds would sit in cool, dark spaces, developing harder exteriors and concentrated flavors. As moisture evaporated, the texture changed completely. After 6 months to a year of aging, what began as soft curds became so dense and hard that peasants couldn't slice it. They had to crack or shave pieces off with knives. These cheeses were basically the medieval equivalent of rock candy, except they tasted like feet instead of sugar. Storage methods for these cheeses were cleverly practical. Most families wrapped their hard cheeses in clean cloth, sometimes sealed with beeswax, and hung them from the rafters in cool rooms. The hanging position kept them safe from rodents while allowing air circulation to prevent unwanted mold. Some regions developed special cheese storage cabinets with ventilation holes carved into specific patterns, early versions of cheese caves that still exist today. Hard cheese didn't just provide calories. It delivered crucial protein and fat during winter months when fresh meat was scarce. A typical family might save several wheels of hard cheese for winter, each representing gallons of precious summer milk preserved for later use. During the coldest months, thin shavings of this aged cheese added richness to otherwise bland soups and gruels. When properly aged and stored, these cheese wheels became so dense they could travel without spoiling. These cheeses were so hard you could use them as weapons, the original way to defend yourself. When grain harvests failed, medieval families turned to their pantry of imperishable foods, reaching next for something small but mighty. For medieval peasants, dried legumes were the ultimate survival food. These tiny nutritional powerhouses, beans, lentils, and peas, could remain edible for decades when properly stored. One study of legumes recovered from an ancient Egyptian tomb found they were still capable of sprouting after 3,000 years. While medieval storage wasn't quite that impressive, a family's bean supply could easily outlast the harshest winter or worst harvest failure. What made legumes so valuable was their perfect combination of shelf stability and nutrition. Unlike grains that provided mostly carbohydrates, legumes packed serious protein, crucial when meat was scarce or unaffordable. A medieval peasant working the fields could function on legume-based meals because they provided long-lasting energy and muscle-building nutrients. A medieval farmer eating beans for breakfast had the medieval equivalent of protein powder, minus the Instagram workout photos. Storing these life-saving foods required careful attention. After harvesting, peasants dried their beans and peas thoroughly in the sun, sometimes spending days turning and monitoring them. Any moisture left could trigger mold or sprouting. Once completely dried, they transferred the legumes to clay containers with tight-fitting lids or woven sacks hung high on walls, safely away from hungry rodents and dampness. Mice in medieval homes had to stare longingly at those hanging bean sacks like kids outside a candy store with empty pockets. Before eating, these rock-hard foods needed serious preparation. Medieval cooks soaked dried legumes overnight, then boiled them for hours in hanging pots above the hearth fire. This long cooking process softened the tough skins and neutralized certain compounds that could cause digestive distress. Without proper cooking, medieval bean soup could turn the family cottage into a methane production facility. Most medieval households combined legumes with whatever scraps of flavor they could find. Herbs from garden patches, bits of salt-preserved meat, or even just wild onions scavenged from nearby fields. The resulting thick stews became daily staples that filled bellies when little else was available. For elderly peasants with worn-down teeth, dried legumes posed a challenge. Many households ground their beans into rough flour that could be stirred into soups or mixed with other grains. While these tiny protein powerhouses kept medieval stomachs full, peasants still needed something to soak up all those hearty stews. Have you ever wondered why medieval peasants didn't just pop down to the local bakery every morning? Because they were busy making rye bread that could last for weeks. Black bread, as it was commonly called, stood as the foundation of the medieval diet across northern Europe. Unlike modern white bread that starts growing mold after a few days, medieval rye bread stayed edible for up to a month in cool conditions. The secret to this longevity wasn't preservatives with unpronounceable names, it was good old-fashioned sourdough fermentation. Medieval bakers maintained sourdough starters like precious family heirlooms, passing them down through generations. These living cultures contained beneficial bacteria and wild yeasts that naturally preserved the bread by creating an acidic environment where mold struggled to grow. Some medieval families treated their sourdough starters better than their in-laws. At least the starter produced something useful. The bread itself looked nothing like today's fluffy loaves. Dense, dark, and heavy enough to use as a doorstop, black bread had a distinctly sour flavor profile that modern taste testers often describe as challenging. The crust formed a hard protective shell that kept the inside from spoiling, while the dense crumb resisted mold growth far better than airy modern breads. Medieval bread was so dense that dropping a loaf could qualify as an occupational hazard for your toes. Baking day in a medieval household was a major event, usually happening once every week or two. Families would produce multiple large round loaves at once, using communal ovens in many villages where oven access was scheduled and shared. The first loaves eaten would be relatively soft, but as the days passed, the bread gradually hardened. By week 2 or 3, medieval diners would often need to dunk their bread in soup or ale just to avoid chipping a tooth. This practical food storage solution came with nutritional benefits too. The sourdough fermentation process broke down phytic acid in the rye grain, making minerals more available for absorption. It also pre-digested some complex carbohydrates, making the bread more nutritious than if they'd just ground the rye and baked it without fermentation. As bread slowly hardened beyond edibility, medieval households found other uses for it rather than waste a crumb. The truly stale pieces weren't tossed out. They were saved for thickening soups or feeding animals. When even black bread couldn't sustain a family through winter, they turned to protein that walked on 4 legs until it didn't. Dried meat might sound plain to us now, but for medieval peasants, it was the original fast food, ready to eat in an emergency, yet lasting for months without spoiling. When winter winds howled outside, a strip of preserved pork, beef, or goat could mean the difference between going hungry or having dinner. While modern refrigerators keep our steaks fresh for days, medieval preservation techniques kept meat edible for seasons. The drying process began immediately after slaughter, as families couldn't afford to waste an ounce of precious animal protein. First, they cut meat into thin strips or small chunks to increase surface area. Next came salt, lots of it. The meat sat for days completely buried in salt, which pulled moisture out while creating an environment where bacteria couldn't multiply. The amount of salt used would make a modern doctor faint faster than if you told them you have ice cream for breakfast every day. After the initial salt cure, peasants hung their meat in smokehouses, simple wooden structures where smoldering hardwood fires created smoke that deposited antimicrobial compounds into the meat while adding flavor. In regions without dedicated smokehouses, families suspended meat high in their cottages, usually near chimney openings where rising smoke could reach it. Some clever households built specialized rafters above cooking areas specifically designed for smoking meat. The slow drying process could take weeks, but the results lasted months. Different regions developed signature styles of preservation. Northern Europeans often cold smoked their meat at low temperatures over many days, while Mediterranean peasants used less smoke and more air drying in their warmer climate. In particularly damp regions, some families stored fully cured meat in barrels, completely buried in grain or dried peas to absorb any remaining moisture. The resulting preserved meat bore little resemblance to fresh cuts. Dark, dense, and intensely flavored, It could be eaten as is or added to stews and soups to provide rich protein. Medieval jerky was so tough that eating it counted as both dinner and a jaw workout. Travelers valued dried meat highly, carrying strips on journeys where its durability and concentrated nutrition made it the perfect travel companion. While meat hung from rafters, medieval cooks were already planning what to do with everything else, crafting survival foods that could last through the leanest times. Long before bouillon cubes lined grocery store shelves, medieval peasants created their own version of instant soup using bone broth cubes. This ingenious food preservation method turned animal bones, parts that might otherwise be discarded, into concentrated nutrition that could last for months without spoiling. The process started with collecting bones from whatever animals the family had eaten. Waste not, want not was more than just a saying in medieval times, it was survival. After meat had been removed for immediate eating or drying, bones went straight into the cooking pot. These weren't quick recipes. Medieval cooks simmered bones for hours, sometimes an entire day, extracting every bit of flavor, fat, and gelatin. A properly made medieval bone broth turned solid when cooled, thanks to the natural gelatin released from joints and marrow. This wasn't just a happy accident, it was essential for preservation. The resulting jiggly mass looked like something between modern Jell-O and that mysterious leftover container in the back of your fridge you're afraid to open. But this wobbling brown substance represented food security for hungry months ahead. To create portable, long-lasting cubes, medieval cooks poured their reduced broth into shallow wooden trays or clay dishes. After cooling completely, the solidified gelatin was cut into small blocks and dried near the hearth or in the sun until the moisture content was low enough to prevent spoilage. These dried broth cubes were basically medieval flavor bombs, except instead of blowing your mind, they kept you from starving. Storage was simple but effective. Most families wrapped their dried broth cubes in clean linen or stored them in covered clay pots. During winter months when fresh food was scarce, dropping one of these concentrated cubes into hot water created an instant nutritious soup. Adding whatever vegetables or grains were available turned this simple broth into a complete meal. The genius of bone broth cubes went beyond just preservation. They were lightweight, portable emergency food that could restore strength to someone weakened by hunger or illness. Medieval travelers sometimes carried these cubes on journeys, knowing that a life-sustaining hot meal was just a campfire away. While these humble cubes provided liquid nourishment, medieval people also valued foods that could be eaten without preparation during long journeys or hunting trips. Nature designed walnuts with their own preservation system, a hard protective shell that medieval peasants recognized as nature's perfect food container. These tough-shelled treasures became essential parts of winter food supplies because they could last over a year without any special treatment other than keeping them dry. No salting, smoking, or fermenting required. Just crack and eat. Walnut trees grew across much of Europe, though they were more common in southern regions, where the climate was milder. Medieval peasants would gather nuts during autumn harvests, competing with squirrels and birds for this valuable resource. Wild walnut gathering often became a community event, with families claiming favorite trees or groves year after year. Many households planted walnut trees near their homes specifically for food security, creating a legacy that would feed their grandchildren and beyond. After gathering, nuts were dried thoroughly to prevent mold, then stored in simple mesh sacks or loosely woven baskets that allowed air circulation. These containers were often hung from rafters or placed in cool, dry storage areas. Medieval nut storage operated on one simple principle: keep the mice out and the air flowing, or your winter protein stash becomes a rodent retirement home. The nutritional value of walnuts made them worth their weight in bread. Rich in fats and proteins, a handful of walnuts could provide lasting energy for hours of hard labor. Medieval peasants understood this instinctively, even without knowing about calories or nutrients. Parents would often set aside special stores of nuts for children during growth spurts or for pregnant women who needed extra nourishment. Walnuts weren't just eaten plain. Medieval cooks ground them into coarse flour to thicken sauces or mixed them with herbs and garlic to create rough pastes similar to modern pesto. Some regions enjoyed walnut-sweetened breads as special treats, using honey to bind crushed nuts into the dough. Grinding walnuts by hand was such hard work that medieval cooks probably had forearms like modern arm wrestlers. Beyond the dinner table, walnuts served another crucial role: medieval currency. In many regions, nuts were valuable enough to barter for other goods or services. A sack of quality walnuts could sometimes purchase items that coins couldn't, especially during winter when food became more precious than metal. When hunger struck between meals but cooking wasn't possible, these portable protein packages came to the rescue. But for longer preservation of other foods, medieval kitchens relied on something much more acidic to keep meals safe. Sour, sharp, and seemingly immortal, vinegar stood as one of medieval cooking's most valuable ingredients. Made from fermented wine, beer, or fruit juice, this acidic liquid never spoiled. It literally couldn't go bad because it was already bad in the best possible way. What started as a simple souring of alcohol transformed into a preservation superstar that protected other foods from decay. Medieval households produced vinegar almost accidentally at first. When wine or beer went sour, resourceful peasants discovered this tangy liquid could extend the life of vegetables, fruits, and even eggs by weeks or months. Soon, deliberate vinegar production became common practice. By allowing alcohol to sour in open-air barrels with special bacteria, families created their own supply of this preservation miracle. The science behind vinegar's power is straightforward. Its high acidity creates an environment where most harmful bacteria simply cannot survive. Medieval pickles probably killed more bacteria than their doctors did. This acidic environment transformed perishable summer vegetables into winter staples without a refrigerator in sight. Storage methods for vinegar were elegantly simple. Most households kept their supply in sealed ceramic jugs, wooden barrels, or glass bottles if they could afford them. The containers needed tight seals not to protect the vinegar, but to prevent its sharp odor from permeating the entire house. A medieval kitchen with an open vinegar container could clear sinuses faster than modern allergy medicine. Beyond food preservation, vinegar served multiple practical purposes. It cleaned tools, treated minor wounds, and even addressed lice infestations in human hair. Most impressive was vinegar's shelf life, indefinite when properly sealed. Archaeological discoveries have found sealed containers of Roman vinegar from nearly 2,000 years ago that remained perfectly usable. While vinegar helped preserve many foods, sometimes medieval peasants needed something safer to drink than potentially contaminated water. That's when they turned to a beverage that even children could safely consume. Don't drink the water wasn't just travel advice in medieval times, it was a survival strategy. Al, a low-alcohol beer brewed in nearly every home, saved countless lives by providing a safe alternative to often contaminated water sources. Families didn't understand germ theory, but they knew from experience that people who drank ale instead of water from the village pond got sick less often. Unlike modern beer with its higher alcohol content, medieval ale was a humble, cloudy drink with just enough alcohol, usually 1 to 3%, to kill harmful bacteria while remaining appropriate for daily consumption by everyone, including children. The brewing process involved boiling, which killed pathogens, and fermentation, which created an environment where many harmful bacteria couldn't survive. Women dominated the brewing industry in early medieval periods, with the term alewife referring to female brewers who often sold surplus ale to neighbors. These enterprising alewives were the original craft beer influencers, except their marketing strategy involved a pole with a bush tied to it outside their door rather than Instagram posts. Most medieval ale contained a simple recipe of malted barley, water, and wild yeast. Hops, now standard in beer, weren't widely used until later periods. Instead, a mixture called gruit, containing herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, and heather, provided flavor and some preservative qualities. Medieval ale probably tasted more like a weird herbal tea than modern beer, but when you're thirsty enough, even liquid bread tastes refreshing. The nutritional benefits of ale shouldn't be overlooked either. A quart of ale could provide up to 400 calories, significant energy for hardworking peasants. This liquid bread helped people survive when solid food was scarce, especially during winter months. For travelers journeying between villages, ale offered guaranteed hydration without the risk of unfamiliar water sources. But for those preparing to stay in one place through the cold months, another durable mixture of grains offered sustenance in a form that could sit on a shelf until hunger called. Porridge mix might sound boring to modern ears, but for medieval peasants, it was their version of instant food. a ready-to-cook mixture that required minimal preparation yet delivered maximum survival value. This strategic combination of ground grains, dried herbs, and sometimes powdered root vegetables formed the backbone of daily nutrition across medieval Europe, especially when fresh food ran scarce. Creating the perfect porridge mix began with selecting grains. Oats dominated in northern regions where cold, wet conditions favored their growth, while barley and millet appeared more commonly in southern areas. After harvest, peasants dried these grains thoroughly, then processed them using hand-powered stone querns or community mills. Medieval teeth got such a workout from porridge that dentists would have gone out of business if medieval dentists had existed beyond the guy who also happened to be the blacksmith. What transformed mere ground grains into proper porridge mix was the addition of clever flavor enhancers. Dried herbs like thyme, sage, or mint added taste and slight medicinal benefits. Some regions incorporated dried fruit pieces or ground nuts into wealthier households' mixes. More commonly, peasants added dried and powdered wild vegetables to give the bland grains some character. Storage solutions for porridge mix were brilliantly simple. Most families kept their supply in tightly woven cloth sacks or sealed wooden containers, often hanging from rafters to keep rodents at bay. Preparation was so simple that medieval cooks could literally make breakfast half asleep. The original, "I haven't had my morning porridge yet" excuse for grumpiness. The true genius of porridge mix lay in its adaptability. In good times, it might include luxury additions like honey or milk. In lean times, hot water alone would suffice. This humble mixture sustained countless generations through harsh winters when little else was available to eat. But even when porridge wasn't enough, medieval peasants could always fall back on another grain that required minimal processing, yet offered maximum storage life. Tough, resilient, and harder to kill than a medieval legend, the whole barley earned its place in peasant storage bins through sheer stubbornness. This remarkably durable grain could survive conditions that would ruin other foods, thanks to its natural hull that provided built-in armor against insects, moisture, and spoilage. Medieval farmers valued barley for its ability to grow in poor soil and harsh conditions where other crops failed. After harvest, peasants dried barley thoroughly, then stored it in ceramic pots or woven sacks kept off the ground. The pests that would happily munch through other grain supplies often gave up on barley. Even medieval mice had standards about how hard they were willing to work for dinner. Cooking barley required serious commitment, hours of simmering before it softened enough to eat. A full belly of barley porridge could keep a medieval farmer plowing fields longer than modern office workers can stay awake during afternoon meetings. Barley served multiple purposes: ground into flour for flatbreads, added to soups, and most famously, sprouted to create malt for brewing ale when water became questionable. While barley required cooking facilities and time, medieval people also valued foods that could be prepared with minimal equipment. Made with just flour, salt, and water, no yeast needed, flatbread became the ultimate survival food for medieval travelers and those with limited cooking resources. It could be cooked anywhere you could make a fire, whether on heated stones, over open flames, or pressed against a clay oven wall. The secret to flatbread's impressive shelf life was its complete lack of moisture. Unlike raised bread, flatbread dried thoroughly during cooking. After cooling, these flat discs hardened into cracker-like rounds that could resist mold for weeks or months. Medieval flatbread was the original hardtack, with emphasis on hard. Bite into a month-old piece without soaking it first, and you'd be visiting the town tooth puller faster than you could say dental plan. Northern Europeans made theirs primarily from barley or rye flour, while Mediterranean cultures preferred wheat. Some bakers added dried herbs or seeds for flavor and nutrition. After cooling, flatbreads were stacked, folded, or rolled, then wrapped in linen cloths. The bread was usually stacked on high shelves, safe from children and pets, medieval childproofing at its finest. When hunger struck, flatbread could be eaten as is or quickly rehydrated by dipping in water, ale, or soup. While flatbread sustained bodies with its simple nutrition, medieval people also craved sweeter preserved foods to lift their spirits during dreary winters. Fruit leather brought sweetness to medieval winters long before grocery stores sold fruit roll-ups in plastic wrappers. Made from mashed berries or apples, this natural treat preserved summer's bounty when sugar was a luxury few could afford. Medieval families collected wild berries, plums, and fallen orchard fruits, cooking them down to a thick pulp before spreading the mixture on clean cloth or wooden boards to dry in the sun. The drying process concentrated natural sugars, creating chewy, intensely flavored sheets that could be rolled and stored for months. Kids today beg for candy at stores. Medieval children probably followed their parents around, asking how many more days until the fruit leather was ready. Storage was remarkably simple. Once completely dried, fruit leather was rolled up and stored in linen bags, often hung from kitchen rafters. The high sugar content acted as a natural preservative, preventing most spoilage if kept dry. During winter celebrations or as special treats, small pieces were cut off and enjoyed as a rare sweet flavor in an otherwise bland diet. Travelers carried these concentrated fruit rolls on journeys, knowing a small piece could provide quick energy when needed. While sweet treats lifted spirits, medieval kitchens also preserved cooking fats for times when animals grew lean. Rendered animal fat served as medieval cooking oil with an incredible shelf life. After slaughtering animals in autumn, peasants carefully collected every scrap of fat, knowing it would provide essential calories and cooking medium during lean winter months. The rendering process was straightforward but crucial. Chunks of animal fat were slowly heated until they melted, allowing impurities to separate and be strained away. The resulting clear fat, once cooled, could be stored in sealed crocks or bladders for months without refrigeration. Medieval kitchens might have lacked fancy gadgets, but they discovered fat preservation long before spray cans of cooking oil existed. Properly rendered fat remained usable for half a year or more when kept cool and sealed from air. Different animals provided distinct types of cooking fat. Pork fat remained softer and was preferred for pastries and general cooking. Beef and sheep fat became hard when cool, making it ideal for longer storage and creating light sources. Some medieval kitchens had so many hanging fat containers that bumping your head meant getting both a headache and a greasy hairstyle. From salt to rendered fat completes a remarkable system of food preservation that allowed medieval people to survive through harsh winters and uncertain harvests, all without a single refrigerator in sight.